I just spent the last 5 years learning 9,899 ways to not write unit tests. The solution is so simple. If I had just done these 5 things instead of those 9,899 other things, I could have saved myself and my team hundreds of hours of lost time and still been just as effective with my testing. If you followed these 5 steps, you could literally today start reaping the benefits of something that I wish I had known 5 years ago. Perchance methinks I mayeth understandeth these things one day. But what did I do? In this video, I'll break down these 5 tips and show you exactly how I use them so that you can regain your precious time, just like I started doing on my projects. And the first one is, drumroll please, kotest or kotest. Honestly, I'm not entirely sure how you pronounce it, but thankfully pronouncing it properly is not a requirement for using it. So I'm just going to call it kotest for the rest of the video. This all starts with the tooling, and my best projects with unit tests, they all use kotest. What is it? It's really 3 different things jammed into one. It's a unit testing framework that's packed with a runner and includes the ability to perform basic assertions. I like this tool because it feels really natural to use, and pretty much all the code you write with it reads really well. It also includes 10 different unit testing styles, so regardless of what kind of style you use on your project, you're pretty much guaranteed support with this library. So whether you do BDD, TDD, whether you write your tests at your desk, or whether you write them on your private yacht while eating peeled grapes with caviar, kotest will be there to accommodate you. Of all of the different styles that they support, I personally prefer the describe spec. Now, out of all of these, this is really up to you which one you choose, but honestly, I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later on. I do have some thoughts on it. But really, here is the kicker. They have a plugin, and in particular, it's loaded with 2 great features. The first one is templates. Basically, anytime that you create a new test, you have the ability to use one of their basic templates to get you started for all of their different testing styles. So that means the basic setup's already taken care of for you. This works especially well for large tests where you know you have a bunch of tests that are already working and maybe you just need to see if 1 or 2 of them are working. So you can just hit the play button beside one of those and get your results really quickly. In particular, this works really great if you structure your tests properly, which is a great lead-in to the next point. My next recommendation is that you nest your tests. So this isn't really talking about a tool, but it's more of a technique. And at this point, this is all about effectiveness. My most effective tests maximize the amount of reusability and minimize the amount of copying and pasting that I have to have. In my opinion, the worst offender of this copying and pasting is the old JUnit style tests. This was particularly problematic for functions which had a lot of branching inside of it. You'd have a lot of setup at the very beginning, you'd copy it onto your next test, and then you'd have to change just 1 or 2 things in order to get a branch working, but most of your setup was the exact same. With this style of testing, at very best, you'd have a before each at the top of your class that would do things like class level setup, but the rest of your setup that isn't class level goes into each spec. Even if they have a lot in common with another spec, you still had to copy and paste it and reapply it in each of your tests. This isn't exactly a problem with the tool. I'm not blaming JUnit. There are ways around this, especially with more recent versions of JUnit. It's more of a problem with the mindset. It's the en masse copying and pasting and being okay with it. And it really breaks the don't repeat yourself principle. Don't repeat yourself principle. Don't repeat yourself principle. Plus, it makes maintaining your unit tests really difficult. So imagine a scenario where you have 1 change that you made in your implementation, and you have a bunch of tests that you copied and pasted inside your unit tests. You're gonna have to go and update all of those manually because everything was copied and pasted. So, in this case, your solution could be using a describe spec style setup. And my best friends will also get the same advice from me that you're getting now, so listen up. In this paradigm, the test setup is additive. The way this works is you have common setup going in at the very top of your tests. So this would be things like class level setup that applies to every test inside of your suite. And then you can indent your code with another describe block that say tests one of the functions. So all of the common function setup can go in at the very top. And let's say you have some branching inside of your function. Then you can nest 1 more time, and then only make the changes that are necessary for that particular branch. That makes doing branch testing inside of your code really easy because all of the setup was done beforehand, and all you need to do is change your 1 condition before you run all your tests. In fact, it makes your testing really lightweight, sort of like, I don't know, lifting balloon dumbbells. The third technique is to use custom templates. Now I mentioned earlier that the kotest plugin has a way of doing this for you, but the thing is it only sets up the class. All of my tests, I have a certain amount of boilerplate that I started off with. And since I was doing that with all of my tests, I ended up creating a template in IntelliJ. It's really simple. All the templates that were pre-built into IntelliJ or that you created will show up there. And one of the great things about this is that you can share all of your templates with your team by simply syncing your idea folder to your repo. So that means that they're going to get your templates and then you get theirs. It's sort of like a master's level class in productivity in 30 seconds. One of the templates that I use most often for creating unit tests simply does these three things. It names the class of my test, it creates a UUT, and then creates the outer describe block for me. So all I have to do is start populating a UUT and start writing my tests. Now this is my particular flavor of starting all of my unit testing, and yours will likely be similar. This template eliminates pretty much all of the boilerplate for setting up a unit test almost entirely. There's a link down in the description if you'd like to see my templates and anything else that I've done in my IntelliJ projects. Tip number 4 is live templates. This basically takes the previous idea and it's like getting a giant bowl of nachos and turning it into a giant party. File templates only work for new files, but what about when you're inside of a file already and you have some boilerplate that you need to get through? This is where live templates come in. You're going to have some amount of repetition whenever you're setting up your suites and your specs, and live templates make that even easier by minimizing the amount of boilerplate that you have to type. To use a live template, all you need to do is type the shortcode to activate it inside of your code, hit tab, and bam, faster than you can say grilled cheese sandwich. Never mind, it's already populated. I have several IntelliJ live templates down in the description below. Most of them are around unit testing, so for things like setting up suites, specs, mocks, and things that we're used to seeing. This is also great because you can export this configuration and share it with your team as well. Now we've arrived at golden tip number 5. Hold on while I get this from my top secret fireproof vault. Just kidding. Actually, it's on this sticky note right here. So let's go back and talk about kotest for a second. This tip consists of 2 parts, project-wide config and what kotest calls isolation mode. Let's look at project-wide config first. On their site, they have an entire section dedicated to project-level config. It's basically a Kotlin object that lives at the root of your unit testing project, and it configures the framework behavior for every single test. They have over 24 properties that you can set, but one in particular is going to save you so much time. Isolation mode. But Oliver, you ask, other than a maximum security prison cell, what is isolation mode? Well, I'm glad you asked. This configures how the engine creates instances of each of your specs. There's 3 ways it can do it, but in particular, one of them is so valuable. Instance per leaf. All right, I'll tell you why it's so special. Let's take a look at this example. This example is directly from the kotest website. As you can see, the way the hello is printed out behaves exactly like a before each. So that means I don't need to prepend each of my specs with a before each before setup. All I need to do is type the code right above my spec, and it will always run before your spec. And this is pretty significant because most other frameworks that have a before each require you to use it because they're always like, well, we have no guarantee that any of your setup code is going to happen unless you put it in a before each. And I'm always like, okay, well, that means I need to do these things. First, I need to create some null variables outside of my before each so that I can have proper scoping, and then separately, I need to do all of my setup inside of a before each. Then whenever I run the code for each of my specs, that means I had a bunch of optional variables inside of that code that have things like question mark dots or double bangs, even though you knew they always had a value. You just had to play the game of the language. And now we can throw all of that away because that means I don't need to worry about variable scoping and making sure that everything is set up inside of before each. So that means all of the null vars that I have outside of my before each can become vals. And then they're not optional and the before each goes away. So I can just set them up right in line. And then all of my specs, I don't need the question mark dot or the double bangs anywhere. This all happens at once in just a few lines of code. I mean, at this point, it's like your tests are practically on autopilot. Unless, of course, you're writing unit tests for RxJava. There's an entirely different set of rules when it comes to unit testing, something that's inherently asynchronous and reactive in nature. But I've been doing it for years. I can test just about every corner of my reactive code. If you found RxJava as pleasant as, say, pulling teeth, continue on to this video here. Otherwise, I'll see you next time on TLDR Android.